Let me introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Alexandra Zanfaki. She is the United Nations Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights and cultural diversity. She's Professor of Law here at Brunel. She's a leading expert on cultural rights, and her publications are about cultural rights of minorities and Indigenous peoples, also about cultural diversity, cultural heritage, and the way we balance cultural rights with other rights and other interests. She's a senior fellow at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies and a member of the Summer Human Rights faculty in Oxford. She's very well known as the founder of the Athens Refugee Project Award, where students have volunteered since 2016 with refugee civil society organisations. So please welcome Alexandra Zanfaki.
Hello, and welcome. It's a real pleasure to be here again face to face, but also online. And I guess this is a new way of things a new way of things that are going to be done in the future. So today we are going to have this discussion on global conflict. And at some stage I thought maybe it should be on Ukraine. And I think that we are all very focused on Ukraine at the moment, and understandably so. We are witnessing immense suffering, and there's very little we can do. And this is quite painful. But I think gradually, after the first few weeks, we started questioning our focus, especially in Western Europe, our focus on the war in Ukraine, and our understanding as if it was the only war or the first war that is going on, as if this suffering is more than the suffering in other conflicts that exist at the moment around the world. And in other conflicts, not so obvious, that still exist at the moment in Europe, as Anita is going to discuss later. As you heard, I am the United Nations Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights and cultural diversity. And all United Nations Special Rapporteurs, we have been very committed to raising human rights issues as the war goes on. So we issued from the very beginning a communal statement, collective statement, where we talked about the right to life and prohibition of torture and liberty and security, etc. But as the weeks go by, we see that other issues are also equally important. In my field, I am quite concerned about the destruction of cultural heritage. At the moment, we know that there are more than 300 sites of cultural heritage and objects of cultural heritage that have been damaged. But even more so, and we do want something to do about this, and the media are starting to rave about the fact that maybe we should talk about war crimes and maybe something should be done. And in a way, I'm very aware that things should not be looked at from a white and black point of view. So what I am quite worried is that the rhetoric is very much about Ukrainian cultural heritage and Ukrainian suffering. However, Ukraine was and has been a multinational state, and the destruction of cultural artifacts come from Ukrainian culture, but also from the Russian culture, from the Greek Orthodox culture, and other cultures that coincide. So, starting to think about the post-war reconstruction era, we are very eager to highlight and focus on the multicultural aspects of the reconstruction. Also, this conflict showed us and allowed us to discuss issues relating to how women and how men are portrayed in media. The men who are soldiers and fight for their country, the women with the children who leave and go to other countries as refugees. So we are very concerned about stereotypes that have to do with gender, and we would like to dig into these issues more. And finally, we are quite concerned in my mandate about the prohibition of cultural defenders, artists, but also athletes, indiscriminately from events, from cultural events and sporting events. And I think that we understand that when these athletes and cultural defenders represent the Russian state or Belarus, we understand why they may not be allowed to participate in such events. But I think that we have to be very careful not to allow discrimination and a new form of racism and prejudice hide our better judgment in these decisions. So at the moment we are working on a press release relating to cultural heritage and cultural rights in the Ukraine conflict, but also we have approached sporting associations to discuss further the raison d'etre and also the raison d'etre of their decisions regarding athletes. So I'm really looking forward to listening more about other issues that focus on the conflict in Ukraine, but also the issues we should also be discussing equally on conflicts in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Investigator in the project Human Rights and Religion, which is funded by the Institute of Communities and Societies. Before this, he was advisor to the State Secretariat for Human Rights in Rio, Brazil, where he led a team working on the most extreme forms of conflict, things such as torture, freedom of speech, contemporary slavery, and witness protection. He's also interested in memory and truth issues, such as the moral justification of conflict and the destruction of archives, dismissal of witnesses, and disappearance of bodies.
Hello. Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Alexandra. And thank you all for coming and for joining online as well. So, what I want to discuss with you today is the role that human rights discourse plays in democratic countries and its impact in global conflict, such as the one we are seeing now in Ukraine. As you probably know, human rights are not only legal, they are also moral. What we call human rights is an astounding political claim, a universal claim, that every single person in the world is uniquely valuable. When the idea of human rights was first formulated in modern terms, it was revolutionary. This idea fueled wars, the enlightened revolutions, as they were called, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, which included a brutal civil war, fought about the right of some people to have other people as their property, and also the Glorious Revolution in this country, I think could also be listed here, after all, the Bills of Rights from 1689, which grant us here some fundamental freedoms emerged from it. But when we talk about human rights today, I'm not the first to say that we have two more recent foundations to consider. First, there is the United Nations Declaration by the end of the Second World War, in which a few fundamental things were outlawed internationally. After the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, it became illegal for any state to persecute minorities of any kind in racial, cultural, or religious, or even political terms. The impact of this document was massive, and it turned the persecution of minorities into a crime, genocide, a powerful word. And as a consequence, many of the ideas that fueled the countries of the Axis alliance then, during the Great War, were taken out of the public sphere, especially racist and nationalist claims of superiority. Democracies were now understood not only as the rule of the majority. A true democracy was a government of the majority that did not oppress any minority. However, human rights also have a more recent foundation. If 1948 was the first 20th century foundation, the year of 1968 was perhaps a second foundation for it. And here I'm talking about the emergence of a human rights global movement, an international collaboration between people, non-governmental organizations, and social movements that shaped an international civil society revolving around the idea of human rights. In the 60s and the 70s, there was civil unrest in many parts of the world. And what happened there was perhaps an awakening. Several minorities and interest groups realized that although they were not necessarily being exterminated by the state, they were nevertheless being treated as non-humans or as second-class citizens. And I'm talking about segregation, racial and gender discrimination, political and religious persecution. These people were being denied their freedom and basic rights. They were denied human rights. This was a powerful discourse. It connected people globally. In the USA, this human rights discourse turned the civil rights movement into a beacon. In South Africa, it fueled the anti-apartheid struggle and ignited many liberation and anti-colonial movements worldwide. But as you know, when something is a success like this, it doesn't take long before it becomes a propaganda tool of some politician or a bureaucratic, heartless policy for certain state actors. And for those of you here today who lived through the 80s, as I did, you will remember that several international conflicts of that time revolved around human rights. The most significant, perhaps, was the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dismantling of the Soviet Union. North Americans usually boast about winning the Cold War by successfully producing more weapons than their communist adversaries. However, for a Latin American like me, it seems pretty clear that it was not the weapons, but the human rights discourse adopted by the Carter administration in the US that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we know that because although it was aimed at the Soviets and the Allies, it also hit the dictatorships supported by the US pretty bad. When the international doctrine that raised Latin American military dictatorships against the communists was over, their leaders were left alone with what they had. They were privileged provided with, abundance of weapons that would eventually fall in the wrong hands, the technology for illegal tap wiring, censorship, torture, and disappearance of bodies, many of which would undermine the rule of law in their countries later. And they were also left with the angry crowds and civil society movements all around them. They eventually fell, together with the Soviet Union they supposedly opposed. The 90s brought in a different approach to these issues. Human rights, now branded by the winners of the Cold War, was a discourse that became embedded in diplomatic parties and military interventions, some pretending to be humanitarian wars. This is what we entered the 21st century with. The discourse I'm talking about, you remember it. It goes more or less like this. If you're not a democratic country, we'll bomb you, destroy your army, invade your territory, and forcibly impose democracy to you. We have seen this over and over since then. I could mention here the more recent invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, and the terrible civil war as tragic examples of what happens when human rights are used as an excuse for military interventions, or when people believe that they can export democracy and human rights using armies and bombs instead of schools and books. But coming home now, what is the relevance of this human rights history to the global conflicts we are seeing now around us? My hypothesis here is that this demoralization of human rights discourse, or better put, the dismissal of a kind of a neoliberal human rights discourse that we now see, has potentially given the floor back to those who have lost it before. Those political groups whose ideas have been defeated in 1945 and their discourses that have been excluded from the public sphere since 1968 have silently crept back and taken the stage. Racism, sexism, religious persecution, hate speech, things that liberal democracies were supposed to have overcome, they are here now. The very things that Western countries condemned in other countries, countries they opposed during the last decades, they are now here. very close to us. There are several possible explanations for this, and I will not have time to deal with all of them now, but I have a clue, I think. I'll have to finish, but just very briefly, explaining how my most recent project may help in finding answers. In a seed project called Human Rights and Religion, supported by the Brunel Institute of Communities and Societies, I'm currently tracing back the criticism of religious leaders who oppose social inequality and economical inequity and were persecutors for their ideas in Brazil. They were mostly Protestant and evangelical minorities who were arrested and tortured for preaching what they believed was the gospel. But they were actually accused of communism before being excommunicated and arrested. My hypothesis is that one of the reasons why human rights were demoralized in our liberal democracies is their incompatibility with permanent social inequality and deep structural racism. I think human rights are not compatible with those things. If all people are really human, how can you treat them like things or treat them worse than animals? Are people really all human and equally valuable for being so? Or is our individual value determined by our moral, political, social, and cultural choices? Those are hard questions that challenge our conception of human rights today. And I believe that looking at these guys, what these guys, theologians and religious leaders, were saying in the recent past about these issues might be a way to learn what went wrong in the history of human rights and in the individual moral ethics we now profess. I will finish with a sentence from a famous Catholic bishop of the time that explained their concerns and summarized the challenge those interviewed in the research project faced in the 60s. I quote, "Every time I help the poor, they call me a saint. But every time I ask, why are they poor, they call me a communist." Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Excellent. Our next speaker is Patricia Hobbs. Her research focuses on international criminal law and the cooperation regime set up by the Rome Statute. She looks specifically at the meaning of cooperation and the concept of trust in international law. And her research interests also include the study of meaning in language and symbolism and their effects on the successful implementation of international law, including international humanitarian law.
Thank you, Meredith, for that introduction. As Meredith just mentioned, my focus tends to be on the International Criminal Court and the cooperation regime set up by the Rome Statute, which is the statute that has set up the court. So really, generally speaking, I tend to look at the international crimes, the worst crimes perpetrated in international community, within states, so being war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, as well as the crime of aggression. But for today's talk, I thought, given the focus as presented earlier by Alex, I thought, given my interest as well in language and symbolism, actually I want to sort of divert my attention to the genocide speech that started or gave a pretense for Russia to go into Ukraine in that so-called military operation. So that's the title of the brief presentation: Appearance, Imagery and Symbolism, Russia as Protector of Minorities. The genocide speech, and I think Marcus alluded to it, the word genocide is a very strong word, it's a very powerful word. If you look in the internet, it is full of pictures, gruesome, terrifying pictures that convey the image of what genocide is about. But what we know in the legal community is that genocide has got a very clear legal definition. I'm not going to go into that as such, but you have to have a specific intent to destroy in whole or in part certain groups of people because of certain characteristics that they do possess. And we're never far away from genocide. We had genocide in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and we also, in the same period, more or less, we had genocide in Rwanda. So acts of genocide are never too far away. And that is why the language, the genocide speech language used by Putin back in sort of the January, February, or even before, because we know that actually Putin used very similar language back in 2014 when it came to the annexation of Crimea, the so-called voluntary annexation of Crimea into Russian territory. The same underlying, let's say, sort of thinking was present at the time already. But this time it came through a little bit more powerful. So see, I just sort of reproduced some of the quotes that you can see in front of you, quotes that Putin himself stated. So quite clearly he's referred to genocide as if it's a given fact. And let's be clear, genocide in court, if you have to try and prove genocide in front of the International Criminal Court, it's actually quite difficult to prove because of that specific intent. So if you are a head of state and go about on a daily basis, claiming that there is genocide taking place in Ukraine against a certain region in eastern Ukraine, it would carry some sort of authority, okay, because we're talking about the head of state here. So what is happening in Donbass today is genocide, exterminating the civilian population. The so-called civilized world prefers to ignore it as if there were none of this horror genocide that almost 4 million people are being subjected to. Now, this is quite an interesting quote because I'm going to talk in the second part of the brief discussion that I have is about a very interesting but nebulous concept in international law called responsibility to protect. And so when you hear a quotation like this, the so-called civilized world, so this is pretty much the rest of the international community. It may well be, generally speaking, the Western world, unfortunately, but it is the Western community that has generally reacted and interfered in the affairs of the state if they have seen atrocities perpetrated in front of us. That's certainly what happened in Kosovo, okay, the bombing of Kosovo, when that particular intervention was not strictly legal, but certainly moral, okay? The intervention that, we couldn't watch the things that we were watching in front of our screen, our TV screens, without actually doing something about it. So that's what happened in Kosovo. So when you see a quotation like this, the first thing that I thought of, and this is why I picked the topic for today, was Russia is somehow very interesting trying to portray itself as a protector of certain groups of people in a Donbass region, which led to that military operation. So the purpose of this operation is to protect people who, for 8 years now, so this is going back to the Crimea situation, have been facing humiliation and genocide perpetrated by the Kyiv regime. So again, is that word genocide very powerful, with very powerful images of terrifying horror used quite loosely and with a certain element of authority by Putin. But this leads to, generally speaking, the Western community. So we have seen it in Libya. We have seen it in Syria, although in Syria it was not successful for the reasons that I will mention in a minute. If we see atrocities being perpetrated, then we would try and help, okay? Or intervene, rather, than help to stop such atrocities. So what I've reproduced in the screen is the responsibility to protect doctrine, which emerged after the intervention in Kosovo. As I said earlier, the intervention in Kosovo was in the name of humanitarian intervention, was driven by morality. It was not sanctioned by the Security Council. And the reason for this is that the use of force, generally speaking, in international law is illegal. But in the context of self-defense and when dictated by the Security Council, then it can become an acceptable and legal operation. Now, of course, this is not always the case. We know after Kosovo that that particular intervention was driven by morality because it was NATO-driven as opposed to dictated by the Security Council. But that particular intervention led to this particular doctrine, responsibility to protect. Okay. Again, the concept itself is very nebulous. It is pretty much in the same line as humanitarian intervention, with the only condition, if you want, that the Security Council needs to be behind that decision all the time, as opposed to humanitarian intervention, which has been taken unilaterally in the past. And we don't want, because of the illegality, generally speaking, of the use of force in international law, we do not want states to go and intervene in the affairs of other states. The problem with the responsibility to protect is that it is, again, a very nebulous concept, as I mentioned before. It is not a settled principle or norm in international law. Putin never quite invoked it, because they never actually used the words responsibility to protect. But if you look at this third quotation, which is really what grabbed my attention, is Putin is becoming the defender of atrocities. In this case, Putin somehow sees atrocities, genocide specifically, occurring in Donbass region. The international community, which normally, just like after Kosovo or after Libya or after Syria, of course Syria did not succeed, and I'll explain that in a minute, would normally react to such atrocities and they would do something. But in the face of the Donbass region, the international community did not do anything, and therefore Putin took it upon himself to engage in this military operation to protect its own people from, as he clearly stated, from humiliation and genocide. The third pillar here is the one that is relevant when it comes to responsibility to protect. So if a state is failing to protect its population, the international community must be prepared to take appropriate collective action in a timely and decisive manner and in accordance with the UN Charter. Okay. So as I mentioned before, the intervention in Syria did not succeed because you need Security Council resolution to actually embark on this particular intervention. Given that Russia and also China vetoed, their permanent members, and vetoed that particular intervention, it did not occur. But it did occur, of course, in Libya, as we know. But the problem here with the use of language by Putin, first with genocide, okay? And genocide, as I said, is a very specific legal definition. And if you do not meet all the criteria, then it can be anything else. It can be human rights violations, potentially torture or degrading and humiliating treatment, but certainly not genocide, which amounts to an international crime. But the problem is with the responsibility to protect, and when we see atrocities and when we see war crimes being perpetrated in a different country, it has become a redundant principle. It's never quite well established, but what we do know is the only way that it can become established if the Security Council permanent members actually play in a nice way, let's say, and certainly not in the way that Russia has been behaving in the past few years, but certainly with regard to Ukraine in the past few months. So has Russia become the protector of Russian-speaking people in Ukraine? Well, this is debatable. The next few months and the next few years, when the cases will go to court, or when the International Criminal Court hopefully will gather all the evidence, we will see the truth of what Putin and the Russian forces have actually done. What we do know is that the use of genocide language creates a different narrative, creates a false narrative. And even claiming that you are going into a country to protect people, as I said, Putin never used the phrase responsibility to protect, but he certainly gave that impression that because the international community was clearly doing nothing, it was up to him, the burden of responsibility to go and protect the citizens. It's all about different and false symbolism, an overarching use of language that is imprecise and that is false and that leads to a distorted reality. But we just need to wait. Until the cases go to court to remove this narrative and create the real narrative that is the illegal use of force of Russia against Ukraine, and obviously with the atrocities being committed as we speak. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrizia. Our next presentation comes in the form of a film. We'll watch an excerpt from a feature documentary film made by Danielle Rugo and by Abby Weaver, and then following that there'll be a short filmed speech by Danielle. So he is an award-winning filmmaker. He's a reader in film and television practice here at Brunel, with interests in documentary and conflict, world cinema, and film philosophy. About a War, which is the name of this film, explores violence and change via testimonies of former fighters from the Lebanese civil war. Abby Weaver is a feature film producer and founder at age of only 24 of The Breakfast Cinema Limited. So I'm handing it over to people who can play the film.
ما أنا حسيت حالي إنه الحرب إجت لعندي، وحسيت حالي إنه أنا هذه الحرب هي خيار بدي غير، خيار بدي أخلص من هذا الصراع مع الحياة، ومن هذا الشعور اللي إنه تحس حالك إنه الحياة دائماً مهزومة، عم تهزمك يعني الحياة. وكنا كل يوم نحن عم نعيش الهاجس الأساسي إنك كيف تقطعي هذا اليوم وتقدري تستقبلي اليوم الثاني. فكان في مشكلة بأبسط الحاجات الحياة. هلا بس اجت مجموعة أحداث صارت بوقتها، الثورة الفلسطينية، تدريبات وسلاح وهيك ألوان عسكرية صرت شوفها، دفعتني الأمور والحماسة والشغف إنه أنا يعني هذا الحياة ما بقدر أغيرها، ومثل غيري دفعته الحياة إنه خير لا خلينا نعمل حرب، نحن هني هول سبب مشكلتي. الحرب يمكن ما تموت فيها، بس أكيد إذا ضبطت منها رح يموت منك 3/4. حتى اللي بده يعيش بالحرب بيبقى عايش منه ربعه مش 3/4، و3/4 بكون
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniele Rugo, and I'm a reader in film and TV at Brunel. The extracts that you've just seen are from a film called About a War that I co-directed with Abby Weaver, and that was released in cinemas in the UK in 2019. So 3 years ago now. The film is one of the outputs of a AHRC-funded research project called Following the Wires, which looked at the long-term impacts of the Lebanese civil war. The film specifically looks at how the city itself was weaponized, and the infrastructure of the city, electricity, telephones, water, and so on and so forth, was weaponized by various parties to the conflict, and follows the stories and the recollection of three militia fighters, three former combatants, perpetrators, call them what you like, as I said, recall their operations at various moments in the fighting. They are three men who started fighting very young, when they were 12 or 13, 14 years old, and they spent their whole youth basically fighting during the war. The film was, as I said, premiered at the Curzon Soho in the UK, London, and was then released in the UK in various Curzon cinemas, but was also screened worldwide, participated in festivals and so on and so forth, and most importantly was screened and continues to be screened in Lebanon in various initiatives led by an NGO called Fighters for Peace, which gathers former combatants from the Lebanese Civil War who are now activists working on conflict prevention and peace-building initiatives, trying to target marginalized groups, especially young people, who are themselves at risk of being recruited or have been recruited in conflicts taking place in and around Lebanon, and of course Syria is one of them. Interestingly, the project led then to two more grants, one which is ongoing called Memories from the Margins, with colleagues who were already part of this previous one, and Memories from the Margins is now looking at what is an untapped topic in Lebanese society, which is the presence of more than 100 mass graves in Lebanese territory dating back from the Civil War. And of course, some of these mass graves are likely to contain the remains of some of the 17,000 disappeared from the war. This project is again producing another feature-length documentary, and we're working very closely with a newly established National Commission for the Disappeared in the hope that the evidence and documentation that we gather for the film and the testimonies that we gather for the film will be used by the National Commission in its investigative work.
Thank you, Danielle, and yes. Okay, our next speaker is Katja Sarmiento-Mirwald, and she's a political scientist who specialises in European politics. Her work mainly focuses on cross-border integration and social relations in the European Union, with a special focus on Poland, France, and Germany. The work she's presenting tonight was funded through a British Academy grant, and welcome, Katja.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Meredith, and thank you to the organisers for having me here. When I was first invited to this event, I did alert the organisers to the fact that my research focus is not only on post-conflict societies, but actually more on what could more accurately be termed post-conflict societies. So after some of the bleaker messages you've heard today, you might be ready for something a little more upbeat. So I'd like to invite you to follow me into the past, perhaps for a glimpse into what a future after some of these dreadful conflicts we've been hearing about have ended, as to what a process of reconciliation might look like. As Meredith said, I am a specialist in European politics, and a good part of my research focus is on the so-called security community that is the European Union. In a security community, effectively war has become impossible and indeed unthinkable, and there are widespread attempts at post-conflict reconciliation and at building trust between the post-conflict societies. In this, my work is heavily influenced by the work of mostly American political scientists who have actually come up with this idea of a security community where war is not only impossible, but also unthinkable. And I'm also influenced by, as it happens, mostly German sociologists who analyze the ways in which societies in Europe, in the European Union, have become very tightly interwoven, and they analyze the flows of communication, of trade, of people that happen between these members of the security that is the European Union. But I must say, being a political scientist myself, I have long been dissatisfied by these two bodies of work because of their unfortunate focus on the aggregate level of analysis. They analyze countries. That's fine, to be sure, but inevitably such a focus implies that post-conflict reconciliation, for example, is measured through the existence of treaties. If there is a treaty, two countries have reconciled. If there isn't, maybe they haven't. Likewise, those German sociologists tend to operationalize or measure trust in terms of trade flows. Now, to be sure, treaties and trade flows are important, but they can only get us so far. So in my work, I really try to bring the individual level of analysis, people, back into the fold. And I ask, in post-conflict security communities, what are the preconditions for the development of trust in other nations, and specifically in neighboring nations? Is it perhaps the degree to which a place or a nation might still appear to be threatening, objectively or subjectively? Could it have something to do with the cultural similarity that we share with other nations? Or is it something about their level of socioeconomic development? It is actually none of those things. In a recent piece of research, I have drawn, therefore, on the lessons of another discipline, namely social psychology. And I have found only one necessary condition for the development of trust in other nations. And this is that the contact experience that people have with members of other nations must be perceived as pleasant. This may not seem terribly surprising to you, but it would actually be terribly surprising to those American political scientists and to those German sociologists with their focus on the aggregate level of analysis. But the finding that I've come across is quite clear, and it is clearly informed by social psychology. Individual contact experiences and how they are perceived by the people in question are really important in how they shape trust in other nations at large, not just in the individual members that we've had contact with, but in those nations at large. My findings were informed by a survey that I commissioned among Poles in Poland a few years ago, actually prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I've got for you a graph. Don't worry if you are not keen on statistics or graphs, I will talk you through this. This is just one of the pieces of analysis that I've drawn from that survey, but it is one that is quite easy to present, which is why I wanted to share it with you here. So this is based on a survey where I looked at the effect of recalling mostly pleasant contact experiences with members of four nations that border on Poland, namely Germans, Czechs, Ukrainians, and Lithuanians. And you see here the most important part of that graph is boxed in red. So controlling for a few other things, we see here that the effects for having recalled pleasant contact with those four nations is firmly to the right-hand side of the line going through the zero. In other words, there's a positive relationship here. People who recalled mostly pleasant contact with, say, Ukrainians tend on average to express higher levels of trust in them. And the opposite is true if you go into the line below that for unpleasant contact recalling mostly unpleasant contact, say, with Germans, actually is associated with fundamentally lower levels of trust in Germans at large. So that's the headline finding here. I make no claims about how far these results travel. This is very consciously a research project that's focused on 4 nations that could conceivably be called members of a security community, with the possible exception of Ukrainians. Recall that this was carried out a few years ago. But this does show quite clearly that in such a setting, in a post-conflict setting where contacts between members of different nations have become quite abundant and where these nations are basically right across the border, it is not the features of the object of trust that matter. It is not the degree to which they are perceived as threatening, because for the most part they are not. It is not the degree of cultural similarity that they share with us, and it is also not their degree of socioeconomic development that they have. It is actually in the individual contact experience that the potential for future reconciliation and for future transnational trust lies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katja. I knew you belonged on this panel. Okay, now for our final speaker. This is Anita Haworth, and she's going to offer us a post-colonial situating of Priti Patel's Rwanda plan. It builds on her existing research on migrants and refugees, which included a co-authored book about Calais. She's also published a meta-analysis of 100 years of British policy on asylum, which looked at the long retreat from the ideal of humanitarian sanctuary in the 19th century to Theresa May's hostile environment. The paper Anita's working on now brings this teleology up to date with a similar analysis of asylum policy under Home Secretary Priti Patel, and it adds a new dimension to her work, the view of the Rwanda plan from the vantage point of the global south.
Thank you for the organisers, and thank you for coming to listen to us. The recent announcement by Patel to send illegal migrants to Rwanda has attracted an enormous backlash. There are already legal suits that have been initiated. They're still in the early processes or the early stages, but I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to go into that. What I do want to note is that it says something when Theresa May, the architect of the hostile environment, finds this a step too far, when it's condemned by her as callous, inhumane, and contrary to the image of Britishness, whatever that might be. So what is the problem with this deal? Initially, it was briefed by the government as an offshore arrangement to process asylum applications. That is what they used to create a safe passage for some of the Syrian refugees to come to Britain. That's not what this is. This is 2 deals piggybacking off each other. The one is a deportation arrangement, so it's a one-way ticket for anybody the Home Secretary has deemed unwanted and illegal in the country. It's a one-way deportation ticket to Rwanda. The deal that it piggybacks off is a £120 million development deal for Rwanda. It's that combination that is purely toxic. And it's that combination that has stoked an enormous backlash, particularly in Africa. So what I want to do is have a look at some of this. I want to put it also in a context where this week the UN has announced 100 million people are displaced, the highest ever. It's coming in the context of a global food crisis that is going to ravage Africa. The most exposed communities to that crisis are in Africa. Rwanda has a human rights abuse record that last year the government's own document condemned. And in particular, its targeting of LGBTQ people, and also its treatment of refugees. This is the context in which Priti Patel thought this was an acceptable deal. Hannah Arendt in 1948 herself, a German Jew forced to flee from Nazi Germany, drew attention to how hollow the notion of inalienable rights of the individual are when the individual depends on the nation state. And as Marcus pointed out, what happens when human rights come up against structural racism? And a lot of my work has tracked the structural racism in British asylum policy. There is, as you can probably tell from my accent, I am South African. There is a different approach to my ability to come into this country as there is to a black South African. It's not about the nationality, it is about the race. It is structural, it is institutional, it is perpetuated, it is continued, and it has been taken to a new level by Priti Patel. We cannot understand what is happening without understanding that structural racism. And that's one of the reasons why I turned to have a look at, in particular, the perspective from Africa. How do they view this particular deal? This is not just a British deal, it's not just a Eurocentric problem. The African states and the African Union have resisted attempts to externalize European borders down into the south. The 2015 migrant crisis flagged up the problem when you have thousands of people seeking asylum landing on your shores every day. So rather than have them coming here, European states have sought to create offshore, if you like, processing camps. Some of them they wanted deep down in Africa, as far down as, on the borders of countries that border on the Democratic Republic of Congo. The African leaders in the African Union have generally resisted those moves. And the main reason that they have resisted them is a fear that this is a new form of colonialism, that European countries, former colonial powers, will get their toeholds into Africa, and it's a way of doing it. One of the main reasons they've resisted, but also for a lot of them, refugee issues, asylum seekers, migrants are hot political potatoes. You just have to look at the xenophobia and xenophobic attacks in South Africa to almost despair. Rwanda is an odd one because it was never a British colony. It was colonized by the Germans and by the Belgians, and only for a relatively short period. In terms of the geopolitics of Africa, that makes it more acceptable for the Rwandans to do a deal with Britain when they probably would not be able to politically sustain a deal with the former colonizers. It also explains why Britain turned to Rwanda. Rwanda had a deal with Israel in 2015 for a similar kind of deportation. It failed, but most of the details behind the actual structure of the agreement are hidden. The reasons for its failure are obscure. What happened to the people that were deported is less known. Those that managed to stay in Rwanda are effectively on starvation levels. So it's not a very good track record to look forward to. So how then have some of the Africanists and post-colonialists constructed this in discourse? The first discourse is of a 21st century imperialism, in which human development has become a political tool for the powerful. This is seen as having historic echoes of slavery, indentured labor, and the concentration camps that predate Hitler and Stalin, and that are conveniently very often forgotten from history, particularly those that are a million miles of Kenya were surrounded by razor wire during the British occupation. The second discourse that comes up is a discourse of an uglier vision of development diplomacy. And it's based on claims that the rich country uses its financial power to support development. What makes this particularly morally abhorrent to a lot of the African commentators is that in this particular case, what Britain is doing is derogating its international obligations to process asylum seeker applications in the country that the asylum seeker chooses. That choice is being stripped away, and instead, Britain is Patel plans to deport those people who did not come through legal routes. The problem is there are hardly any legal routes, and those that do exist for the Afghans and Ukrainians are so tied up in it's difficult to know whether it's ineptitude or willful obstruction or what. But look at the proportion of Afghans and Ukrainians that have managed to get into Britain and apply for asylum, and it's a fraction of what it is elsewhere. What is happening is that development and deportation are being interwoven in this particular deal. The third discourse that's coming up from Africa is that of pessimism. There's no good precedence, as one commentator put. And they draw attention in particular to Rwanda's human rights records, as I said, on LGBTQ people, the particular use of police brutality against refugees, the potential ramifications, as I said, of a global food crisis that is likely to exacerbate tensions in what is Africa's most overpopulated or crowded country. The idea that Britain is doing this unknowingly does not hold water. When there's a government report from 2021 that flagged up concerns about human rights abuses in Africa. So my contention today is that viewing the Patel plan only as a deportation agreement, leaving aside the discourses of offshoring, because that's not true, but viewing it only as a deportation agreement supports a Eurocentricism that misses the critical dimension flagged up by the post-colonial discourses. And that is a deeply disturbing interlinking of asylum, deportation, and development. That speaks to me of an even more deeply disturbing, possibly even sinister dimension to the direction of British foreign policy post-Brexit. My closing comment would be, Brexit has necessitated this, because prior to Brexit, whether you support it or not, and it would have been possible to have an agreement to deal with this, prior to Brexit, it was possible for Britain to return people who had landed here, that they deemed to have landed here illegally, to other European states. They have so alienated the relationships with other Europeans that the deportation to other European states is now at its lowest level in decades. The deal comes out of that context. And it comes out of a need. If we don't want to see this kind of deal, it comes out of a need to see how relations get rebuilt with Europe in a way that you don't have to turn human beings, desperate human beings fleeing for their lives, you don't have to turn them on cargo on ships or planes. Collateral damage and an incredibly destructive asylum policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. I'm going to leave you now and hand over to my colleague Shona Corrin-Patterson, who's the director of Brunel's Global Lives Research Centre. She is a really, truly transdisciplinary scholar with expertise in marine biology as well as social justice and environment policy, so really spanning the sciences. Her guiding focus remains the generation and translation of defensible research informed by the needs of society and co-created with the intended beneficiaries. She spent her working career building partnerships and knowledge exchange networks with local communities and stakeholders to achieve mutually beneficial social and ecological goals. And she's going to join us now for the panel discussion.
So shall we start our discussion? And shall I go first? Prerogative. Anita, let's start from the last discussion. I was very interested in your take on the Patel the Patel decision, but I was wondering, do you think it's going to happen? Because to fly all these people to Rwanda and to kind of leave them there and all the money that is involved, I wouldn't even dare attaching the moral considerations to Patel's judgment. But the financial considerations are quite high. And also I think that the British public have made, for once, their opinion quite obvious. So do you think it's going to happen?
Difficult one. Logically, no. Given the nature of the politics, I wouldn't put it past Priti Patel to try it. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some that go, because I think a government that is prepared to effectively stop Parliament because it doesn't want scrutiny, I wouldn't bet any money on it not going ahead. But I think it's in for one hell of a ride to get there. I think, coming back to Patricia's point about the symbolism, I think this is a deeply symbolic action. Whether it goes ahead or not, an enormous amount of damage has been done about raising the possibility of this. Denmark is planning to do the similar kind of thing. So you're in a situation, it reminds me of what happens when you let the genie out of the bottle. In 1996, Tony Blair raised the prospect of revisiting the Geneva Convention. This is demolishing it. And I think that symbolism, there needs to be serious considerations as to how we shore this up. I think we're in a very dangerous state, and just looking at whether it's deliverable or not may miss some of the bigger risks, particularly around the symbolism.
Yes, I think you're right, and we see how human rights, as Margaret said, are used as justification. So first to go to Patricia, protection of minorities. So suddenly, this is the justification for the invasion. And I was wondering, do you think that we allow this? Do you think that Putin's discussion and references to being the protector of the Russian minorities in Ukraine is going to make a difference in the liability that maybe he's going to have before an international criminal court, maybe?
Probably not. I think in the long term, things will be revealed for what they are. The problem is, in the short term, you have this false narrative being built around this accusation of genocide, and around one of the other objectives of Russia was to denazify the Ukrainian population, which effectively would probably lead to numerous war crimes being committed as well. And we already had the first war crime trial just a couple of weeks ago in Ukraine. So I think in the long term, in the long term, things will be sorted. Things will take the shape that they're supposed to take. There is currently a case which has gone to the International Court of Justice in relation to Russia's allegations that Ukraine is involved in genocide, because obviously Ukraine has made an application against Russia here. So the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is looking into this. It will take its time to deliberate as to whether, given the evidence presented, submitted by Russia, as to whether there is, or there isn't, rather, the acts of genocide being perpetrated in Ukraine, which gave the impetus for Russia to intervene in such a way. And also in the long term, we know that, again, the International Court of Justice, in a context of state responsibility, but also the International Criminal Court in the context of individual criminal responsibility, will take over the cases. So we will know the truth. The truth will come out in due course. It's just that in the short term, you have this false narrative that is being built. And I often wonder, the average Russian in Russia, living in the countryside with very little access to social platforms, the internet, what do they think? Do they really believe the narrative of Putin? And this is a very interesting concept, for a chunk of population to actually live under this distorted truth. And what will happen when the truth will come out. But as we know, cases, going to either the International Court of Justice or International Criminal Court take a very long time. So we're talking possibly about 5-10 years before, we all hope that Putin will appear in front of the International Court, in the International Criminal Court. If not in front of a domestic court in Ukraine, probably less likely. But evidence has been is being collected as we speak. But it takes years. It takes years for these cases to actually come to court and being decided. It's just that in the short term, the narrative and what do the Russian people actually believe.
I'm not so sure about the short term. And also, you talk about false narrative, and it makes me remember Iraq and, refugee question and vans with, was it rats outside them, etc. So I'm not sure it's only Russia. So the wider context, I really liked the bringing up the wider context, Marcus, and I was wondering, you said the demoralization of human rights maybe is very much because we have the human rights sophists, the ones that use human rights as justifications for more oppression. But what would be the solution? Would the solution be to, first of all, who are the ones who don't use human rights these days? Are we going to divide states in good states and bad states? And also, shall we push aside the ones shall we take them out of the game, the ones that, the states that are seen to be more cynical, or is it better to keep them in the ongoing dialogue?
I don't know. But I think what strikes me, looking back at what we are seeing right now, especially picking up from where Patricia left here, is that there are patterns, that kind of disturb, and there's a danger of trying to make like a conspiracy theory going from one place to the other. But when I look at Priti Patel now, what Anita was saying, I cannot forget the Trump administration and cases that I had to deal with in Brazil. Like in 2018, we had for the first time Brazilian orphans who were adopted by Americans and were deported. Because like before that, Brazil would not take in any Brazilian kid who was adopted by a foreigner and taken away legally, and Brazil would not take it in. But then what happened was a device, like a very tricky device, where these people who had committed crimes in the US, for example, they would pick it up suddenly, like Windrush, like the Windrush cases we had here, taken to prison without accusations, without trial, without anything, and then of course they brought lawyers in. And then the lawyers filled the case for them, like, why is my client arrested? There's no prosecution. This is against human rights. This is not, this is against everything. This is unconstitutional. And then when they were about to be heard by the cases, suddenly an agency, that were created, perhaps abroad, we don't know, because they destroyed the files, actually took them, put them in a plane, laid them down in Brazil, actually used their credit cards, the credit cards of the accused, to pay for the flight ticket. And when they got into Brazil, the police, the Brazilian federal police, at least they say they didn't know where this is coming from. And this guy is Brazilian, so why am I not going to take them in? So they took them in. So actually, the whole tricky situation was made to do what they wanted, like we deport. I don't have to say that most of these people were black, right? Black Brazilian kids who were adopted in the US. But then I think there's a pattern here where the demoralization of Western countries, and of course we know the accusations, I'm not making it up, it was in the American Congress, like the ties between Trump and Putin, like they demoralized the United States, and now Putin is perhaps picking it up and emerging as, no, I am the one who's defending human rights. You see, like those people, they obviously not, and I'm, taking up this role. So I think there's a very tricky issue going on in the global politics that we need to be very careful to, where we're stepping now.
I think you're right. And I wonder, Katja, are we trivializing conflicts by saying that, well, in 10 years' time, you're going to have a celebration together, both parties, in 20 years' time, and this is the way to be happy again, and kind of get out of the conflict danger, or by accepting that this is actually what makes a difference. We know how to take the specific steps, and what steps maybe are you looking to the steps that have to be made in order to reach that point of communities creating pleasant exchanges?
Nobody's talking about 10, 20 years. When we look at the European example, and here two primary examples are those of Franco-German and Polish-German reconciliation. We're talking many more decades than that. So even when we look at Germany's relations and Germans' relations with their immediate neighbors in that context, we shouldn't forget that actually it took Germany itself quite a few years. First it did so in the 60s and then in the 80s to actually admit what it had done and to reckon with that guilt. But in the process of doing so, treaties of goodwill were signed. What is now the European Union was founded as a major peacemaking endeavor for France. And in doing so, the background conditions for that greater intertwinement of societies was created. And when we arrive at that stage, where there has been a reckoning, where there has been an admission of guilt, and where the background conditions have been set for two societies to start interacting with each other again, that's where we reach the point where individual interactions can form the basis for societal level trust that then further bolsters this idea of a security community where future war becomes unthinkable. But this will not happen in 10 or 20 years. I very much hope it will happen at one point, but I'm not specifying a time frame at all.
Thank you. And Sean, I was wondering, how does your work and the work of the Centre relate to global conflict, and how does it all fit with conflicts and trying not to have as many?
The ultimate dream of not being involved in conflict. I think part of lots of different threads that have been spoken about today are resonating with lots of members of the Global Lives and also a lot of academics across Brunel and way beyond. Food security was something that was brought up repeatedly. Climate change is something that is driving food security, but then you have conflict that's exacerbating that security issue dramatically. We're talking about Russia even today, I think, was saying that we'll let food go through through some of these blockades if you agree to certain conditions. There's so much conditionality that's associated with conflicts nowadays, which I think is something that really has been brought up within sort of Global Lives members. Conflict is being driven by climate change, or climate change. These things are so cascading constantly. I'd also believe the inequality piece that continues to come up within this discussion is something that's really key, and how different people of different cultures and different races are being treated at borders as they're trying to flee within sort of the refugee and asylum seeker processes is something that is critical to have a discussion in. But also to bring it back to some of your work, this idea of culture and the role that arts and different cultures can play in creating and magnifying or dehumanizing some of these narratives, I think is so important. So allowing that piece to come about through, whether it's performance art, whether it's through graphic art, whether it's through all sorts of different cultural representations of different narratives, having grown up in both South America and sort of East Africa and Central Africa. I've spent a lot of time looking at sort of conflict art, if you like, and how that can play a large role in providing that discourse space, that open space for more pleasant interactions between people, coming from sort of that same landscape, if you like, that equal sandbox of thoughts, I think is something that cultural rights really does start to unpick.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, it's very interesting to see how, we cannot really see issues separately, and maybe, our first shock at what has happened in Ukraine has not allowed us to kind of create threads and put all the threads together and the links. Shall we open up the floor and see if there are any questions to our speakers? Please.
Thank you. That was really interesting, different perspectives. Nobody mentioned China, and I was just wondering how you sort of squared some of the points that you've made with the very complex situation there, and how you think the West should or shouldn't respond to what's going on there at the moment.
What's going on at the moment with respect to?
Well, particularly with the camps and the
Okay.
and the lack of free speech and the new laws that are coming restricting free speech.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do you want us to take some questions kind of together and then we can address them? Thank you very much. Another question?
Thank you very much. Solomon from the Law School, lecturer in the Public and International Law Division. Wonderful presentations, all the speakers. Two questions I have, one for Anita and one for Katja. For Anita, the question is, you mentioned Israel that had made the decision, the agreement with Rwanda. The question is that the Israeli Supreme Court intervened and annulled the agreement between the governments. And my question is if you see an intervention of the UK Supreme Court, and what does it mean for the role of courts when it comes to political agreements? So this is a question if the UK Supreme Court is going to intervene. And for Katja, the question is you spoke about contacts and you gave an emphasis on individual contacts. My question is if you think there is a difference if the contacts are nurtured through webs, meaning civil society, organized groups, institutions, or it's spontaneous contacts. Because spontaneous contacts, sometimes it's more difficult to be established. So what is the importance of institutionalized civil society connections when it comes to the contacts between former enemies? And thank you very much.
Thank you. So shall we start from the last question first, and then we can move... Katja, sorry.
Generally, so the contacts that we're talking about in my research project, the other thing that was noted about them was that they had to be personal. So these were all personal contacts. Generally, we know from the research that personal contacts that are perceived as pleasant will work either way. There are many attempts, of course, to create such contacts, in a sense, artificially through institutionalized settings, school exchanges, if you like, particular projects designed to bring people together, often actually with quite a strong message. In this contact situation here, the two angling clubs meeting in the border region, being designed to promote reconciliation. That heavy message can sometimes weigh down the effectiveness of such contacts. But of course, institutionalized contacts can be helped by the presence of, say, translators, where there are difficulties in understanding one another's language. But these institutionalized contacts are usually in the minority, and most of the ones we see are those spontaneous contacts, tourist visits, shopping trips, business contacts, for example. And they are far more numerous, and I think you would be surprised at how often people manage to just about muddle along. There will be misunderstandings, there will be some unpleasantness, but for the most part, actually, it is spontaneous contacts that do the heavy lifting here.
Thank you. Anita?
I think it's very difficult to predict how things are going in this country. Most of the predictions I would have made 10 years ago about never happening did end up happening. I think it's dangerous to underestimate how much of a battering the institutions of the state have taken. The persistent assault on lawyers by this government has been extraordinary and deeply disquieting. I would not be surprised if they launched a similar kind of attack on the Supreme Court. I think we need to basically wake up, decide what you want to defend and fight like hell for it, because I think it's sitting at a very, very vulnerable tipping point. And I take Alex's point about public outrage, but this is a government that seems to not care about public outrage. This is a government that does not seem responsive to the institutions that have protected us, whether it be the courts, whether it be the parliament. I don't think we should take anything for granted. I think it may well end up in the Supreme Court. What would worry me is where, and I'm not a lawyer, so I would invite comments from the legal people on the team. What worries me is the Immigration Act that's just coming through Parliament now, or has just gone through Parliament, that makes it possible to deport people who've lived there their entire lives, and it targets particular racial groups. What does that do when people try and move to critique? I don't know, as I'm saying, I'm just speculating. It's something that I will watch the legal commentators to see what they say on this. How is that going to muddy the waters? How does, the lead up to the next election, how long does it take to get to the Supreme Court? How does the lead up to the next election play out with this constant attack on the institutions of decency and that hold? When Peter Hennessy talks about, the bonfire of decencies, where is this?
Marcus, you wanted, yes?
Yeah, thanks, Solon, for this question. And I think there's an interesting thing here, because some of the constitutional doctrine or the constitutional theory that built up democracies after the Second World War, they had precisely that at their heart. It's like there was an idea in Europe before 1945 that Parliament was to be the supreme institution, like the guardian of the Constitution was actually Parliament. And then what happened during the wars, in between the wars as well, is that Parliament managed to pass its powers to the executive branch of power, and we know that gave rise to lots of authoritarian, totalitarian regimes during and after the war. And but then what emerged after that is this idea that the Supreme Court is precisely the guardian of the Constitution because it's not elected. And people say, how is that democratic? It's because democracy, as we have said, is not only the leading of the majority. Every totalitarian regime, and perhaps speaking up from commenting on China now, has always said, we are the true democracy, right? Every totalitarian regime claimed to be a true democracy. They never, no, we are a totalitarian regime. No. So this is true democracy. Liberal democracy is a fake. That's always had been the narrative. But what happened after the Second World War is that the constitutional theory went up to say, after human rights, the majority can, of course, oppress the minority, because the minority will never have the same number of MPs and things like that, and form a government, for example. So it is the Supreme Court that has to have the last word on the Constitution, because they can decide against the majority. They are not elected. So they can decide contra-majoritarian, as they used to say. So I think there's a role for the UK courts to play here, and they have played that role in the Windrush cases that went to the Supreme Court, and they ruled it as unreasonable, which is a very rare thing for them to decide. It was unreasonable to deport someone that lived in this country for 60 years, asking them to produce a document in 15 days. That was called as unreasonable. So I think there is something to be observed there in the role the Supreme Court will play here. And just to finish, in my country, in Brazil, we're seeing now, after seeing a conflict that Brazil was not the first to condemn in the international scenario for a very long time, which was, I'm talking about Ukraine again, Brazil always condemns military invasions, as they consider, and they did not. The president did not condemn the Russian invasion. He actually demonstrated solidarity with Russia, and then say it was a mistake. I confused myself in my speech. I went out of the paper and confused myself. And then we were thinking, what kind of strategy is this? But I just want to make a point that the brutest attacks now and the brutest political struggles in Brazil are attacks between the executive power and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has become the center of the attacks of the executive power. And I think that has everything to do with the fact that constitutional courts are at the heart of the protection of human rights in any country.
Great. And Katja, you wanted something to say?
Just a little note on the side here that even in the European Union, we have two countries that are turning away from liberal democracy, Hungary and a few steps behind Poland. And one of the first institutions that those two countries have attacked, or the governments of those two, is the judiciary. First the media, then the judiciary.
And who's going to attack the question on China? Or are you going to let me do the difficult part?
I tried to go away.
Right. So that was a very good question.
I'll take the easy bit on it and leave you the difficult bit on it.
Go on.
We've known for a long time that those camps were being created. This week, or last week, was the first time we saw photos emerge. There was a massive hack. One of the things that the war in Ukraine has done is that hacking organizations around the world have gone after the Russians in an unbelievable manner. They're hacking into everything you could possibly imagine in the Russian state. What I find interesting about the release of those images on the Uyghur camps is that it's the first time I've seen them hack in on that scale into China. China has one of the tightest defenses against hacking. It's one of the reasons when WikiLeaks set itself up, it used Chinese dissidents to create the firewall so that the likes of the CIA and FBI couldn't get its documents. Okay, it lost on that one. But I think what we're seeing is something different, and I would not be surprised to see more tranches of documents coming out, mass leaking on an unprecedented scale on human rights abuses in China. I think let's see what happens in the response to that, because I think it's going to get to a point where it's unsustainable in the West's concepts of decency. There will be a backlash at some point, I just don't know when. But wait for it, it's going to be gruesome, it's going to be awful, and I think it's unprecedented, and it's a field day for lawyers.
Mm-hmm. That was a very good answer. I don't have anything to add. I have loads of things to add, but for me, you just see what unlimited power of states does, and when states such as Russia, such as China, are allowed to disregard human rights, one should ask oneself, how did this happen? How have we allowed that? Instead, what I hear every day is about the UN. So I think that, part of the rhetoric now and part of the narrative is how the UN is weak. The UN is the states. There is no UN. UN is the states. It's the states that are weak. It's the states who decide the limits of the UN. And I think that's quite interesting. Don't get me started on that. We have Shona, and then I think, do we have any question from the... Yeah. So Shona, you want to say something?
this idea around China and your point, Anita, around sort of the perverse attachment to development that is ongoing. I think China has an awful lot of influence on global South countries because of the conditionality that is associated with aid, infrastructure, food security, and many other ideas. And I think China is sort of playing those cards in the global forum to mean that it doesn't actually have to do that much about a lot of these issues because it has such control over such large swathes of the world. So I think that's just a point to come back to this idea of development and how development is ultimately controlled by a few global actors, rather than being sort of the very sort of idealistic sustainable development goals, Millennium Development Goals, and history that's gone on around international conventions.
Thank you. Very yeah.
Some question from the online audience. It says, it can sometimes feel like the conflict and the issues discussed are worse than ever, and the prospects look more threatening, often on a macro and international scale, which can feel quite hopeless. Does the panel have any thoughts on how we as individuals and communities can influence change, and does the panel have hope?
Oh, millions of thoughts. Let's stay here until 10 o'clock. But can you, maybe each one of the panelists can share one thought and one suggestion about how individuals can, on their own or, together, can help? Shauna?
Sure, I think a large part of this is our own personal education. Knowing more about the context in which we're operating, knowing more about how our governments, in theory, are representing us, I think is a key part to this. And that allows us to unpack different narratives that are associated with global conflict and why decisions are being made. I think we have a personal responsibility to be more engaged in what is being said, how that's being said, how it's being documented, what the truth is, if we can ever find it. That, to me, is something that we have very personal responsibility for.
Great. Anita?
I think the starting point needs to be where we are and where we live and what we do. And sometimes we look for big solutions and big grand gestures. For me, it's what can I do in my daily life? What can I do about the students and the children that go to school hungry, whose parents can't afford to feed them? What am I doing about that in my local community? What am I doing about writing to my MP? What am I doing about challenging the denigration of our institutions? Because those are the institutions that help us fight back. I don't think it's just the Supreme Court. I think it's the NHS. I think it's the education system. I think it's a parliament. And it's a case of saying, where can I make a difference? And sometimes it's not the big differences. One of the things I found most moving in watching the videos that have come out of Ukraine is that the compassion and the generosity of ordinary peoples whose lives have been smashed, and their little kindnesses to each other.
Thank you. Patricia?
Not the easiest of questions to answer. I think certainly in the context, I think human rights has sort of come up a number of times this evening, not just as sort of human rights as atrocities, as sort of leading to international crimes, but also widespread human rights violations. I think awareness has got to be a good thing. Being aware of what goes on around the world. As an international law academic, I always find I tend to have a sort of quite a sort of depressing view and opinion about international law, because I think, going back to the question about China, there isn't much that can be done. apart from, in our little ways, raise awareness, be aware of what goes on, and actually have some amount of empathy and sympathy for the people who live in those countries, and how lucky are we to live in a democratic society where, generally speaking, those kind of human rights violations do not occur. But yes, it's about education as well, and university will certainly do that. This is what we try to do. This is what we try to pass on to the students, to the next generation, but also on a practical view, on a practical point of view. And I think, Alex, you're probably the best example here about the Refugee Project, because so many of us teach about human rights, or even the worst human rights violations and atrocities. But actually the ability and having the time and commitment to do that is certainly, to be applauded. So, and, for you, but also for our students involved in those projects. So that's, it's education and trying to be involved as much as possible in our little ways.
And of course, applications for our degrees are open now. You can always apply. And finally, let's go to Katja first and then Marcus.
It's a question of being a bit stingy with our support. Whom do we support as citizens? Whom do we give our money to as travelers and as consumers? Whom do we give support to as humans? So one of my colleagues, who happens to be Polish, actually put together this website of lots of different support mechanisms for Ukrainians in need currently. This is quite a great resource to go to if one wants to do that little bit more. But also, let's broaden our horizons a little bit. Just because war is happening in Ukraine doesn't mean it hasn't been going on for years in Yemen. Let's look a little further afield too. But make sure that those who get our political support, our financial support, our support in terms of aid, that those recipients are worthy of it.
Thank you. And our legal theorist?
I'm trying to be very practical as opposed to theoretical.
You're not really a lawyer after all.
I think, well, there are several ways people could help. And I believe that, we cannot tell them not to engage themselves as if we are afraid that more people engaging themselves these days will worsen the situation. And sometimes it seems to be the case with social media and things like that. But I would say there are at least two ways that you can engage yourself in human rights. If one of them is the most horrible stuff that lawyers usually deal with in terms of prisoners' rights and things like that. On the other hand, we also have to remember that 1968 is also a foundation of human rights. So there's lots of social movements, NGOs, and in the past we have seen unions, worker unions, churches who are committed to fight human rights violations. And what I would say to how can we do better is like get involved. But not only, this virtual involvement that we are now compulsory dealing with, but connect to other people, connect to organizations. It's not only on the individual level. I don't believe that human rights as a movement or as, institutions who are protecting people's rights can be engaged individually. You need to organize yourself. That's how we do it. Yeah.
So thank you very much, all of you who took the time to be here tonight. One last question, but it's going to be an answer for 2 minutes.
Working. I would like to thank you so much for this amazing event. And I believe social media or human rights belongs to social media news. Okay, there are many issues behind the scenes. Okay, we raised Ukraine war and Russia and all of those which are already published on social media news. Okay, I believe human rights should be something different from social media accounts or TV channels. Okay. We can hear from behind the scenes news that Muslims in India are killed of just being Muslims, and no one talks about it. Okay, and as we know, the Muslims in India are so big population, and they are killed of just being Muslims, and no one talks about it.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that, thank you so much. I think that you're right. We should look behind the social media and behind media, and we should try to kind of go more in depth and also understand the various nuances of different topics. So I think it's time to grab a glass of wine and maybe discuss all these issues further. But before we do that, let's show our appreciation to our panelists.